Good morning or afternoon, everybody, wherever you are in Australia. We're about to commence this webinar. We might just give everyone another minute to jump in and give our team a minute to find Talia and Bianca, co-presenters today. Hope everyone's having a lovely day. If you'd like to add in closed captions, there's an option through Teams to do this. Just click more under the three dots at the top of your screen, select language and speech and select show live captions. Any questions that you have, they can be asked in the Q&A for us to cover off during and after the presentation. And we will provide you with some useful links in the chat at the end of the presentation, and a follow-up email will be included with a link to the presentation. Well, let's get started. Plan Partners acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional owners and custodians of the land where we live and work throughout Australia. We recognise and value the connection and ongoing contribution to land, water and community. We pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures and to elders past and present. We aim to work together with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to contribute towards a more inclusive Australia, because everybody matters. I'd also like to acknowledge any unpaid carers who are on with us today, because we know that they are often the backbone of our society. And I'll get better at clicking my slides, I promise. Hey there, I'm Justine. I am the State Relationship Manager for Plan Partners and Plan Tracker in South Australia and Western Australia. Thanks heaps everyone for joining us. With me today we have the Home and Living team from Higher Up, Bianca and Talia, and the delightful Catherine is in the chat, as are a number of our Plan Partners team. Shout out to Ryan, Amanda, Susanna, Roz and John. Higher Up is a national NDIS registered platform provider that allows people to find and manage their own supports. Higher Up specialises in high intensity in-home supports and behaviour support implementation registered under Module 2A. Higher Up also deliver ILO, Higher Up Plus, the support team lead, and free NDIS navigation support for people who do not have support coordination funding. Bianca and Talia are home and living consultants at Higher Up, specialising in the individualised living arrangements space. So we're going to talk about the difference between ILO and ILA. Together, they will work to design, implement and monitor creative choice-built living environments for people with a disability, ensuring that support is tailored to the individual. Bianca brings over 15 years of expertise across SIL, SDA and ILO. Talia leverages her experience in psychology and complex support leadership to employ a strengths-based lens, collaborating with people and their networks to design sustainable and empowering living models. Today, they're going to discuss independent living arrangements with a focus on independent living options and why flexibility in independent living really matters. So welcome, Talia, Bianca and Catherine. I think we've got a couple of pros on our webinar today. I'm just saying, I was a bit fangirling over that bio that Catherine sent through before. Plan Partners, well, who are we? Plan Partners are one of Australia's leading NDIS plan management and support coordination providers, with a mission to partner with NDIS participants and their communities to champion possibility and an equal society where everyone can achieve their goals. Plan Partners offer a true partnership where customers can rely on our NDIS experience, the latest tools and unwavering support to achieve meaningful goals that enrich their lives. With 5 offices across Australia, Plan Partners support thousands of customers with their NDIS plans and funding every day. So with us, Plan Partners is your plan, your team, our focus. It's kind of cute. Let's go through the agenda for today. And I might just mention, if you do, I don't know if I mentioned it before, but if you've got questions, pop them in the Q&A in the chat, and Catherine and the Plan Partners team will pick them up and we will cover them off throughout the webinar today. As mentioned, today we're going to discuss independent living arrangements with a focus on independent living options. Talia and Bianca will take us through the application and pre-application process, share some tips and tricks around successful home and living applications, and then bring to life some real life case studies just to give everybody an idea of what is totally possible. But before we dig in, we do need to address some of the activity of the past week. Unless you've been living under a rock, you would have heard of the announcement that was made last Wednesday. There was a bunch of initiatives or reforms proposed by Minister Butler. Now, our webinar is not going to dive into this, but we're definitely going to touch upon some of the proposed changes and how they may apply or impact to home and living. We do know that some changes will come reasonably quickly. They will arise from the National Disability Insurance Scheme Amendment, Securing the NDIS for Future Generations bill, which will be tabled following the release of the 2026-27 budget in a couple of weeks' time. But we also know that when the last act was introduced to Parliament, it was introduced to Parliament in March 2024, and it didn't actually go live until October. So we know that we've got time. Currently, what we understand is that NDIS eligibility and planning policies remain in place. That was an NDIS newsletter just sent out this morning. And the advice from the NDIS is that you should continue to access your disability-related supports and services outlined in your current existing NDIS plan. But what happens next, guys? Well, as always, our priority to you and Higher Art's priority, obviously, as well, is making sure that you're kept well informed. We're going to keep ahead of any changes and communicate the impact on participants as soon as we become aware of them. What do you have to do right now? There's nothing that anyone needs to do right now. Just consult your primary sources of information. Use Facebook as a support network, but not necessarily the authority or the expertise. And do know that appropriately skilled organisations such as Plan Partners and Higher Up will only ever give you the most accurate and current information as we come across it. Our agenda today, why flexibility and independent living matters, what is ILA, what is ILO, the importance of a support team, and then some really gorgeous case studies. So that's what we're going to run through today. Independent living can mean a few different things different things for different people. Bianca, take us through some of the key events that have recognised the need for someone or for the community to have flexible living arrangements.
Thank you very much. Sorry for the delay, guys. I was just waiting to be taken off mute. Thank you for having me. Flexibility matters in independent living arrangements because we're really moving to a rights-based housing for people with disabilities, and moving away from sort of those more institutional settings, and having things like the Disability Royal Commission has really called for independent living that is rights-based and based on who and how and what and where they want to live.
Gorgeous. And Talia, where are you? When this was identified in the Royal Commission, in the Disability Strategy and the NDIS review, where did it stem from? How did it come about?
We've lost Talia at the moment. We might need to stick with Bianca for a second.
Woohoo! Okay, Bianca, you're up.
That's okay. Individualised living was sort of pioneered in Western Australia, and so for many years there's lots of ILAs and before even the introduction of ILO as a funding stream that really served for that individual living arrangements, many ways for people with disabilities to live, and it had a lot of state backing from that. And so these arrangements have been established to address needs for more diverse and personal home and living supports. And they're empowering those living how they want within the community. And they're moving away from sort of more of that rigid group home settings where there's, a lot of default that takes away those choice and control. So for people with disabilities, so that includes, things like, how how they want to be supported, who they want to be supported by, and even just things in the home environment. You know, how people have meals, how they run sort of their social schedules. And ILAs also really do have a benefit in the fact that they're quite cost effective and they're person centered in relation to other sort of funding streams and ways of supporting people with disabilities.
Lovely. Susanna, when we get Talia back, just give us the heads up and we'll bring her back into the questions. Otherwise, it's over to you, Bianca.
And do.
All right. So tell us then, Bianca, what is ILA and how does it encompass the whole of the home and living ecosystem as such?
And so it's a broad term in the types of how we look at individualized living as a step away from traditional disability housing models of support and home. And so when we talk about ILAs, we're talking about the way in which people design and build how they want to be supported. And we look at mainly four key areas that make this up. So it's sort of where the person wants to live. So, you know, identifying what those bricks, what we call the bricks and mortar look like, who they want to live with and what the social setups of their home are. And then with that, we want to bring in those layers of support. So not just looking at sort of formal support, such as support workers, but we're looking at informal networks, circles of support and semi-formal supports. And then the other key element that we need to look at is how this is going to be funded. So what's the streaming of support? Is it ILO? Is it SIL? Is it SDA? Or is it core support? And so there's lots of mechanisms that can really help to define how a person lives individually.
So is it fair to say, I'm going to ask you a question now and we haven't prepared this bit, but
Yeah,
so is it
sure.
fair to say that you look at where the person wants to live and who they want to live with first, and then but at the end, you actually consider what funding stream's best suited to that? It's almost like the funding stream is at the end of that thought process.
It's sort of a supplementary in the sense that, you know, having that choice of like who and how and where you live is a fundamental human right. And so let's take that before we consider what a person with disability may need in order to live and have that fundamental human right. And that's how I see it, is looking at the vision first, and that, like anybody else, they get to live and to choose how they want to live.
Yeah, gorgeous. And when we talk about the different layers of support, take us through what that can look like.
Yeah, so there's kind of lots of ways. It's not sort of a one size fits all. There's many options. But what we can really sort of break it down to sort of housemates, so living with a housemate, and that or a supportive housemate model, and that person can receive sort of subsidized rent payments or a payment in lieu of sort of the support they may give, and the layers and how that support is kind of determined is, you know, very individual. A host arrangement is another popular arrangement, and that is when a person with a disability moves into a supporter's home, and so they provide the home and the support. And again, what that support looks like is definitely sort of person-centered. Another way of individualized living choices is living alone. So not everybody wants to live with another person for whatever reason, and so that then it comes to how we build that network of informal and formal support. So it can look like a good neighbour, it can look like on-call or concierge type supports. And then another sort of quite popular living arrangement is living together, and that might look like somebody with a disability or without a disability, and it's sort of a friendship or common interest way of living together. And again, within that, there may be sort of different layers of the team and supports that come together to sort of identify how that works for each person.
Wow. Okay. So reasonably complex, and why you probably need
a
specialized team to actually explore this.
Lots of planning. Yeah,
for sure. Quick check, is Talia back with us?
Not yet. I apologize. I'll let you know as soon as she is.
Thanks, Susanna. You got
No
a beautiful
problem,
radio voice. All right. Okay, so we looked at, and we just mentioned then, Bianca, around the different types of NDIS funding. Do you want to take us through each? I mean, we're probably people on the call are probably familiar with all of these, but let's just go through each of these types of funding arrangements, and perhaps we might pause for a second around SIL and just acknowledge what's happening in that space.
Yeah, sure. So firstly, let's look at sort of ILO, so individualized living options. So that that now sits under home and living as a support, and it's a way in which the supports part of an ILA is funded, and it has a sort of stage 1 and stage 2 component to that. But again, ILO is not the only way to live in an individualized living arrangement, and we'll talk a little bit more specific about sort of the streams and each stage for ILO funding. When we talk about SDA, this is under capital supports in the plan, and it refers to the bricks and mortar, and only 6 to 7%, as many may know, of NDIS participants are eligible for this funding stream. So it's the only sort of funding item that looks at how bricks and mortars can be funded through the NDIS scheme. But again, ILAs can work within SDAs, and depending on how the funding works, this isn't something that we have an area of expertise in terms of eligibility, so we won't talk much further about this today. But it is good to acknowledge that. And then when we look at core funding, we're looking mainly at activities of daily living and how they can sort of fund an ILA arrangement. And that might be for somebody who needs less support per day or more sort of one-to-one support. So, it can be a whole spectrum when we're looking at activities of daily living, but it is based on the funding is based on that one-to-one support. And then finally, we've sort of got SIL, which we, is part of seeing eligibility for that intensive support, and often shared living arrangements are funded under SIL, and the eligibility is that 24/7 need for support.
Yeah, all right. And just in light of last week's announcements, we might just pause for a second and then also get your opinion, or higher ups opinion on, or not opinion, just views, general views or reactions to the announcements, and also what is coming up on the 1st of July that we've actually known about for a little while. So we do know that SIL providers need to either be registered or need to be on the way to being registered from the 1st of July. We know that. That's been, slated for quite a while. But we also know now that around this time there's going to be consultation and design work beginning on the commissioning of supported independent living services. We also know that there's going to be new practice standards for SIL providers. So we know all this. What we also know, and this is interesting, is that in the last quarterly report, there was 23,686 providers in Australia who provided SIL supports. That's good, fine. But there's only 17,982 registered providers in total in Australia at the moment. Now, and not all of that 17,982 providers are going to be providers of SIL. They could be positive behaviour supports. They could be anyone, support coordinators. They could be anybody who chooses to be registered. So what we're going to see, I presume, is a lot of movement in this area, and probably the need for some support from home and living experts at higher up. So Bianca, what is higher ups? Has higher up had a bit of a think about the announcements of last week, and being a registered provider yourself, any comments you'd like to make in this space?
Yeah, it's a really, really good point that you've raised. From higher up's perspective, nothing changes. So we're a registered provider, and we are registered to provide SIL supports where this is in line with the person's goals and outcomes. And so we as an organisation, we don't manage or we have any intention to bring together disability group homes. We are based on one-to-one support provisions. That, as we know from working sort of in the ILS space, we're really passionate about supporting people regardless of their funding to live independently in the way that they want and that best suits them. And so there's many reasons that people who are eligible for SIL, the clients that we work with now and intend to in the future, that have the funding, and they might not live in a group home, they may just have that SIL funding, and it doesn't mean that we can't support them to live the way that they choose. We just sort of, again, we just promote that vision planning and really designing how that works. So in short, we don't feel like our position as a registered provider changes with the July changes in respect, and we just respect and honour autonomy. In providing safe and quality supports while obviously promoting independence.
Beautiful. I couldn't have said it better myself. All right, so now let's look at a comparison of the different funding models. Bianca, do you want to take us through this? You're going to be exhausted by the end of this webinar.
That's okay. I've had plenty of water beforehand. So if I think about the different SIL, ILO and core funding, the best way to sort of describe that is sort of on this spectrum of support. So sort of on this higher, more intense side, you've got SIL, which is for people who are rostered to have typically 24/7 support. Some of that may be shared, some of that may be one-to-one intensive support, and the NDIA will, fund that accordingly. Based on the reasonable and necessary criteria. It may involve inactive and active overnight support. And sort of on the other end of the spectrum is core support, and that's for people who with a disability who live in the community. They have more drop-in support. It may be fewer support requirements, definitely SIL. And so again, based on how they live in the community, it's a mixture of paid support and maybe some informal supports in there. And then sort of ILO sits in the middle. And so the criteria for ILO is to need 6 or more hours of support per day in the home. It can be up to 24. So, ILO funding is there for people as well with complex needs, but it's looking more innovatively of informal and formal paid support. And with ILO, we'll go into more depth, but it's looking at primary and supplementary support. So it's quite different from SIL and core.
Okay, gorgeous. Yeah, I'd love to know more about primary and supplementary support. So yeah, glad we're going to be going through it. All right, so what brought most of the audience here, I'm sure, is what is ILO? Even it's been sort of a thing in Western Australia forever, but came out in the NDIS 5 years ago, not, reasonably new, I suppose.
2020 to 2021 is
so
the
close,
sort of
so close.
Yeah.
So we know that core supports help someone with their everyday activities. SIL is more suited for participants with high support needs and require a significant amount of assistance. ILO sort of sits in between of those things. Talia's not here. Bianca, tell us who's eligible to explore ILO.
Yeah, so the ILO funding stream refers to it's a process. So a process of exploration and design, and then a package of in-home supports. And to explore and look at legibility for ILO, you have to be 18 years or older. You're needing between 6 and 24 hours of in-home support each day. That can look at formal and informal supports, which is definitely something to sort of really tease out whilst doing the application. It's for people who are ready to invest time in exploring and designing future living arrangements. There's lots of areas to talk about when we're talking about individualised living, and they really want to plan, may need support to live independently, but there's, sort of a goal in mind, and that they do have an informal network. So that could be family, friends, neighbour who want to be part of that support. And then what ILO doesn't include is, like all the other NDIS funding, it's not looking at contributing to everyday costs. So that might include rent, mortgages, bills and utilities, furniture, food and internet. It doesn't include that. ILO is for in-home support needs, and so other things like community participation therapies, allied health, they're all funded separately, which is definitely something to think for clients to think about when we separate out maybe what was maybe core funding before. It does have implications, and it is there as an individual support, so it's not there to look at sort of fixed ratios and generally sort of that 1 to 3. They're generally not compatible when we're trying to explore ILO.
So would you say that if one of the prerequisites for eligibility is that you have an informal support network around you, would you say that there would, I guess it's obvious, there'd have to be a lot of pre-work done if someone doesn't have family and friends? Is that when you would have to do a lot of pre-work around creating those circles of support or close neighbours or other people that can come in to actually not guarantee but assist with that eligibility?
It's not necessarily eligibility, it's just the willingness to explore how can we build those informal networks.
Okay.
And that's a capacity building piece.
Yeah, gorgeous. Okay. All right. Okay, so now we know what ILO is and what ILO is not, who it's most suited to. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty of these different stages of an ILO journey. What do you do when you've got to get the funding? What you do when you've got the funding, and then how you can continue along with that funding. All right. First up, stage 0. Now, this step might be one of the steps that may or may not be impacted by the announcements of last week in terms of tightening up on unscheduled plan reassessments. What we know is that tighter criteria for unscheduled plan reassessments will commence 7 days following royal assent of the legislation, whenever that occurs. At the moment, the rules around Section 48 of the Act, or the rules around the Section 48 of the Act, state specifically that a change in a participant's living arrangements must be regarded when considering whether to approve a plan reassessment. So that in hand, we also know that there's just a huge number of plan reassessments being conducted every quarter. We know that the number of participant-led plan reassessments completed in the September quarter of last year was 55,632 and a slight decrease to 48,284 in the December quarter. So it's a huge piece of the NDIS, which the minister is now targeting. But having said that, home and living is also already in the legislation as something that must be given regard to when considering whether to approve an assessment to take place. With this in mind, with these numbers in mind, and with the changes being, we don't have any certainty around this, but Bianca, talk us through stage 0. Any tips you might have in regard to in regard to readiness and timing in light of last week's announcement? What does this mean when you are embarking on, hi Talia, embarking on a home and living journey?
Yeah, I think part of it is obviously there's a few unknowns with the announcement, but home and living is a massive transition for people with disabilities. And so when we're looking at change of situation, it's about having a really robust evidence-based signal to the NDIA. And so, there's some real sort of 101 things like making sure that housing goals or independent goals are sort of updated in portals and as part of the change situation. It's gathering really good evidence, having a really good OT report, functional capacity assessment, housing reports. It's completing a really good change of circumstance. And we've had the home and living evidence are now redundant. And so there's parts of that form that we can speak to in sort of things like statements of impact from informal supports and personal statements of impact. And so it's about sort of really speaking to that evidence-based, reasonable and necessary criteria. It can take some time. I mean, the duration can be as little as 2 weeks to 4, but that's having all your reports in place. And so it's about not rushing this piece because it's really sending a signal to the NDIA. And again, having that application assessed by the home and living panel to say, yep, there's a need for sort of more support, more funding, or to look at the ILO, and in the case of ILO eligibility, to say, yes, the ILO eligibility is there. Often when we get this stage completed in ILO eligibility, we'll get a pre-approval for the support funding in stage 2 if it's done very well. So it really helps people to understand their direction that they're going.
Okay, gorgeous. Talia, welcome.
Hello.
Apologies for the technical issues we experienced.
No,
Talia, not letting you have any time to warm up, I'm going to throw a question straight at you. Prior to this webinar, we had a number of occupational therapists reach out saying, for various reasons, I've got something else on, I'm really interested in this webinar. And I thought, wow, well, that's really interesting that OTs in particular want to hear about what you guys have got to say as home and living consultants. So tell us, Talia, I'm kind of presuming that OTs are present at all stages, but how important is an OT at this stage 0 time? What is it that OTs can do and provide and be the most helpful at this particular time?
Yeah, absolutely. They're definitely integral throughout, but at stage 0, what's happening is that eligibility assessment. And so the really big piece is a home and living functional capacity assessment, really big piece of evidence, and probably the most important one when it comes to assessing eligibility for ILO and in stage 0. But secondary to that, it's also, it's a bit of capacity building. It's starting to think about strategies. It's starting to think about transition planning and working with the support team early on, families and all the stakeholders to really see that long-term vision and work out what steps can start taking place now with that in mind. So certainly throughout, important. But yeah, the evidence and also the consistent contact and sessions with people.
So would you say that, I know that a lot of people have created a niche around being really specialised in SDA applications. Would you say that in general, when you're looking for an occupational therapist to, and it could be someone that's been supporting the person for years, or you might be looking for, would you be looking for another occupational therapist to bring that actual specialised lens to actually nail it at that stage? Would OTs generally have a specialisation in home and living?
Yeah, certainly in home and living. In ILO, we don't really see that there are people who do very good ILO FCAs. However, typically someone who has experience in a home and living application and also knows that person best is always the best person for that role. So, and what we sort of say for ILO applications, we're really looking at read the ILO guidelines by the NDIS, understand that language. We're talking, often we see things like ratios come through where ILO is more an individual support. So it's speaking like that. It's understanding primary and supplementary supports, including the different layers that might be involved. So ILO is not just for your primary formal support workers, but also those layers of informal support. So including those in the application, and of course, more generally speaking to reasonable and necessary criteria, breaking that down, instead of noting that it meets it, explain why an alternative is not best practice, and always linking back to the functional impact of a disability is, very much the case across all home and living assessments and for ILO as well.
Yeah, okay. All right, so I guess that's all very self-explanatory. So the key risks that you guys have proposed at this stage is vague or incomplete forms. What about, I suppose it might be the functional capacity assessment or something like that, but what would make an application vague, or I guess incomplete is just not filling in a field, but what would make the application vague?
Well, typically not speaking directly to the functional impact, not outlining the long-term vision. So what are we looking for from this ILO, and really indicating that early on, recommending a stage 1 and 2 level of support. So, that's your 30, 50, 100 hours early on, and also recommending the level for stage 2 early on.
Right.
We would say, vague in language is also something. So if we're talking, is to say someone is independent but with support, well, really saying, well, that's not independence, and what are the risks of not receiving that support? So really fleshing out each of that reasonable and necessary criteria and each domain of functional capacity, and explaining why for each of those is basically what it means to have a very in-depth and thorough functional capacity assessment for home and living.
So stage 0 sounds to me, as a complete ignoramus, as the most important stage.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is the stage they're assessing eligibility. And so that evidence requirement is definitely very strong for stage 0.
Yeah, okay. All right, fantastic. Thank you for that. And welcome again. All right, so moving on to stage 1. We're going to explore some case studies in a little while, but I felt like this is the fun stage. So exploration design, you've submitted a perfectly amazing articulate application. You've been given, you've been made eligible for home and living funding. You move into exploration
Looks like Justine has frozen for the moment. Did you both want to sort of start talking about the
let's
stage?
pick it
Yeah,
up.
sure. Let's
I
pick
know
this
you're
As
up.
both
long as it wasn't
practiced.
me, that's fine. Let's go. So stage 1, exploration and design, right? So this is when the Home and Living panel have assessed a person as eligible, and they have included stated exploration and design in a NDIS plan. And that stated funding is specifically for the purpose of working with someone and their network to explore a vision, to work out the logistics, and at the end to come up with an ILO service proposal. So this is funded at 3 levels. So level 1 is 3,000 or 30 hours. Level 2 is $5,000 or 50 hours, and level 3 is $10,000 or 100 hours of exploration and design work. And so what we do with those hours is we basically are working with someone to understand their housing goals, to understand their network of supports, understand how they want to live, what their support needs might be, what the risks are, how we can mitigate those risks, and essentially everything in between, everything that makes somebody's home, but also their life. What community is important to them, what people are important to them, and how do we ensure that those people and those things are incorporated in this individualized living arrangement. And so that's everything that we do as part of that process. And at the end, we hope to come up with a very nice proposal for the NDIS, which we refer to as an ILO service proposal. And it's essentially a document outlining everything that we've discussed and everything that we've come up with and how it's going to work and why it is a very good idea and arrangement.
Amazing. I missed almost all of that. So I hope my frozen face was really pretty. I seriously doubt that it was. Okay, so I'm going to catch up with you guys later on about what stage 1 is, because I was busily trying to get back into the webinar.
It's always the
All right,
technology.
let's have a look at that service proposal in a little bit more depth if you haven't already done that. So Bianca, take us through the service proposal.
Yeah, so the service proposal is very detailed, and as Talia alluded to earlier, it's sort of the summarization of some really deep sort of vision and planning work that we do with our clients as well as their support networks. And so it is, an official sort of NDIA document. And so we follow each sort of question and steps. And so we have to look at risk assessments. And that's not just about support, that's the wider sort of ILA, individualized living risk. So a risk can involve things like, what does tenancy look like for them? What does sourcing a housemate look like? What risk does that involve? And so, we're looking at that in a holistic approach. Then we have to really identify how their person-centered individualized living arrangement works. And so it's different with ILO funding in that we have primary supports, and that's generally who the person wants to live with as that primary person within the home. And so it's not necessarily that they provide the most intense type of supports, but it may be that they are a housemate, and all in all, they're there for sort of seven nights per week, that kind of overnight on-call sort of in an emergency, very passive sort of support, and then they're sort of active for 10 hours. So in a person's week, they really are that primary support because they might likely see them the most and be there to support them the most. And then your supplementary supports generally looks like things like your rostered one-to-one supports, but also ad hoc. So it's planning for the whole year. So what will that look like when your housemate, for example, goes on holiday? Who could be there? So do we have funding for sort of sleepovers, or is that informal supports that do that? And then we also have in that supplementary supports a monitoring component. And we really, there's a specific section within the ILO service proposal that talks about how are we going to monitor, sustain, and if things change, how are we going to redesign? So it's really pivoting. It's not looking at something changes, we have to go back to the drawing board. It's like looking at how we can be nimble and redesign an ILO. And so we we have to budget for that and really talk to that. And with that, we have obviously budgets that come into place. Average weekly supports are broken down by each section. And then there may also be some supporting evidence. Sometimes that's also an OT that may put in a recommendation report. And then there may be some supplementary sort of evidence that we provide as well. And again, this service proposal goes to back to the home and living panel. So it has that extra layer of sort of scrutiny, I suppose, from the NDIA to really make sure it's a robust plan.
So can I just ask probably another ignorant question? It goes to the home and living panel, and on the slide that we just discussed before, one of the risks was not properly justified ILO and the application being rejected. I guess I've got two questions. First of all, how can something not be appropriately justified? And secondly, do you get another shot? Do they come back to you and say, yeah, not good enough on this, this, and this, you need to, you know, zhuzh it up and send it back? Is that what happens?
Look, I guess it really depends. It can. And so there are a few reasons that the NDIS could come back and say that either the ILO proposal was not justified, or that they no longer believe ILO is the best fit for this person. Not being the best fit could be a change in personal circumstance or a change in disability. They could say that they believe a different funding stream is more suitable, or they could say it's poorly justified. We don't endorse this arrangement, and they might say, go back and do some more exploration, and come back to us with a plan that, you know, that looks a bit different and that is that we agree with. Typically, if that is the case, it might be because during exploration and design, a request was actually made for a different type of funding. It was maybe seen as more appropriate during that, and the NDIS said, hey, no, actually go back, do exploration and come back with ILO, a service proposal. Or it could be that the numbers don't work and the budget doesn't make sense. It could be that it's clear that this process wasn't done with the person with disability at the centre and involved. Through the service proposal, it needs to be very clear this is best practice, and this is also what they want. There could be conflict of interests involved that get highlighted, or basically anything that sort of, if it doesn't make sense, if another stream of funding would be more value for money for them, or they believe to be better best practice, they could come back with that as well.
Is that appealable then? If they say, no, if you're not eligible for that, but we think you're eligible for that, can you appeal that?
Yep.
You can. Yeah. But you won't always need to. So sometimes they might come back and say, look, actually here's core, but it's to the same value. And then we can work with that. Or, you know, it might be a different funding stream, but it's not always required to appeal it. Yeah. Only if it wasn't sufficient to have somebody live safely in an individualised living arrangement.
Yeah, beautiful.
Another segue to that, Justine, as well, is often when they look at this service proposal and then they build a plan. At the moment, what we're seeing is longer plans because because they're saying, yes, we approve that, and we're getting those longer lengths plans. So it's giving clients more more certainty over like being able to implement their ILO and know, actually, I have this plan for 3 or a 5 year plan, and I can really work with that, and I can really build some longer term goals. So there's benefits as well to having it, approved by the home and living team again.
Okay. I might just pause there for a second because we are getting some questions in the chat. And Talia, I might get your articulation on what the difference is between ILA and ILO.
Yes, definitely. Okay.
Great question.
ILA, Individualised Living Arrangement, and the Individualised Living Arrangement encompasses a broad term, and it's the arrangement itself. It does not matter how it's funded. What it refers to is any type of arrangement that falls outside of what we would consider traditional disability housing, and it's custom built around a person. And so the Individualised Living Arrangement is also reflected by how it's funded, but it doesn't necessarily matter how it's funded. It is still an ILA regardless. ILO or individualised living options is the specific funding stream of the NDIS that was built to support ILAs, but you don't necessarily need it to live in an ILA. So in short, it's a home and living funding stream that can be used to support this work, but is not definitely the only option.
Okay, beautiful. All right. And we'll just check, we'll come back and circle back. I love people circling
if that
back.
makes
We'll circle back and make sure
so many
just
acronyms.
to ram it home.
We love them, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so we've got the exploration and design. We've submitted the ILO service proposal. It has been approved without any markings up or changes by the NDIS, which is fantastic, and come back. And so then you move into the support package itself, into stage 2. Talia, do you want to take us through the implement and monitor stage of an ILO package?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the exciting part, and this is when, I mean, even more exciting than exploration and design, because this is when the vision comes to life, and this is when we're implementing the supports that we've outlined and we've explored during that stage 1 phase. And so as part of this, I mean, really stage 2, we can refer to it as a package of supports, in-home supports. And it refers to both sort of implementing that, so starting it from the ground up and building it, and then the ongoing monitoring of the arrangement once it's set up. So what we might see as part of stage 2 is we might sort of recruit and onboard a formal support worker team. That might include managing rosters. We might sort of deliver that support in home. And then ongoing, we're going to adjust as needed. It might also look at sourcing a housemate, a supportive housemate. It could mean sourcing a tenancy or a home. It could mean looking for a host. But it's implementing the arrangement that we've designed and then checking in regularly. So we often refer to a housing career. We all have a housing career. We're never going to stay in the one place forever, and what we want changes. And that's no different for individualised living arrangements. So part of the monitoring is checking in and seeing, does this still align with what you want? How are your goals shifting? You know, do you have a longer term goal? You want to live with a housemate for now, but in 10 years you want to live on your own. And so we're really checking in to make sure that it's still working, but it also we've got some long-term goals at play as well. And so when we're talking about ILO stage 2, it's funded in 3 levels. And that would have been outlined in the service proposal. So 105,000, 150,000 or 230,000 per year of quoted in-home support. And this is only covering the in-home ILO supports. So it's not community participation, that's separately funded. It's not the therapy budget employment. We look at that as part of the arrangement, but that doesn't fall under those levelled amounts.
Okay. All right. And have you, just off the cuff, have you seen any 5-year plans come out with ILO? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Fabulous. Okay. All right, so now let's look at the higher up overview of ILO funding. So at stage 0, the supporting evidence stage, where you signal to the NDIS that you, the participant would like to pursue a home and living goal. Bianca, take us through the billing stages, or the billing opportunities, if you want to call them that, at this stage.
Yeah, so again, sort of where we help is that, you know, we're helping to bring together that supporting evidence. We work with support coordinators, allied health and family members and the clients, and we'll meet and determine sort of suitability, and we'll give advice, and we'll help sort of to gather the reports and assessments in order to do that. That's stage 0. And again, it's a really important to do that well. So we help, you know, we want to be really part of that consultation. Stage 1.
I'll quickly ask, sorry, Bianca, I'll just quickly ask,
Yep.
Talia, when Bianca mentioned then that you're working alongside support coordinators, OTs, etc., how, I'm curious how that relationship works. What's the support coordinator's role and what's the home and living consultant's role? How do you work together and how do you work apart?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about stage 0, really the support coordinator is leading that if they're in that team. So they very much would lead the application. They would pull us in if they felt they needed to do some vision planning potentially, make sure that these goals align with a participant, and potentially to review the application. But essentially, if a support coordinator is in that team, they would take the lead on lodging the application and ensuring it's complete.
Gorgeous. Okay. Back to stage 1, Bianca.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so stage 1 again, we've obviously, a client's been identified as eligible. It's a stated line item of 30, 50 and 100 hours. It's billed under ILO stage 1, and it's charged at that 114 price capped of that. And again, obviously we explained earlier about how that that process goes. It's an in-depth sort of vision planning, and it has that output of the service proposal.
Can I just ask, how do they decide that the exploration design will take 30, 50 or 100 hours?
It has it's a specific criteria that they will decide on, and so it's called level 1, 2, 3 at stage 1, and then at stage 2 you have level 1, 2, 3, and the stages don't align. So you may get 30 hours in stage 1 but need complex support at level 3, so it's not like you get 1 then 1. You could get a variety of each stage, and it's there's specific criteria to each one. With 100 hours, it's generally that there's a very big stakeholder team. There's a need for lots of complex consultation. At 30 hours, it might be, I know where I want to live. I know who I want to live with. I've got a really good idea. I don't want to move areas, things like that. Less complexity, less consultation with maybe more informal supports and allied health and things like that.
And are those criteria, are they in a document somewhere, or is that just an understanding? Oh, they're in it. Oh,
it's an ILO operations guideline. Yeah.
Okay, beautiful. All right. Should have read it beforehand. Should have done my pre-reading.
The same for stage 2, the criteria that meets level 1, 2, 3 of support funding has its own, it's part of the operational guidelines.
Fantastic. We're going to add that to a link to that in our follow-up email. And stage 2, how is that built out?
Yep, so that's billed under another line item, which is the support model ILO. The monitoring is generally at the same sort of exploration design stage, and then it is a very flexible line item, which it doesn't have a price cap. And so things like one-to-one supports are negotiated maybe with the individual or the service provider, and then things like housemate remunerations again have that flexibility to be billed on as a remuneration weekly package or host payments and things like that. So it's a very flexible line item.
Okay, all right, thank you. I'm conscious of time, and I really want to spend a bit of time celebrating the case studies. So I'm just going to quickly flick through the next slides. We've sort of talked about support team throughout this webinar anyway. Let's have a look here. So, Talia, do you want to take us through Kim? Tell us about Kim's experience.
Yeah, so Kim is an example of somebody who is living in a host arrangement, which is one of those potential ILO arrangements Bianca was speaking to before. And so during exploration, it was noted that her goals are to maintain a job, complete TAFE course, and build skills to live with a friend in the future. So that's back to those long-term goals. It might always not be a forever arrangement, but it's working towards something else. And so the individualized living arrangement, or the ILA, is what we refer to as a host arrangement. And so Kim is renting a granny flat attached to a house. The accommodation within that arrangement is private rental, which is a 1-bedroom granny flat. And then the support arrangement is that the host offers sort of social inclusion, has meals together, and is also available on call for some safeguarding because they live in the primary residence in front. And they also own the granny flat.
Can I ask, is that is that a set number of hours a week, or could that vary? Like, say the host is like not home on a Friday, but would normally prepare dinner with Kim on a Friday. Is that flexible, or is it a set number of hours?
It is flexible to it. So in the initial exploration, we'd work out really how it would look, but at times it's going to need to scale up and at times it will scale down. We would just typically be asking that they were letting us know, or, you know, ensuring that there's those layers of support. So if somebody needs to be there, it might not be the case, not always. Some people can just be okay to spend Friday night on their own. But if it is that someone needs to be there, then we would work out, okay, do we need a formal support worker rostered in during that time? Are there other layers of supports like friends or family, community members that would step in? But very much it varies based on each individual arrangement to how that would look.
And probably just pulling my pants down as a plan manager here, but would that host person need to have an ABN and would be invoicing us?
Yeah. Yes.
Gorgeous.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have various criteria. All hosts and housemates are screened, of course, but and that criteria changes based on the person and their support needs too. There might be additional things, you know, if there's certain medical requirements or anything like that. But yes, billed through an ABN, not through us at Higher Up.
Okay, cool.
And as part of that, I'll just
Sorry, Talia. I just quickly, there's a question that's just come up now. How is it a bit of a joint effort between home and living consultants, support coordinator, participant's family in finding a host or a housemate? How do you go out and find those people?
Look, again, I hate to say, but it's very dependent on the situation. So if there's not somebody who's already in the network, some people have a really large community, and there might be a few people who have already identified themselves as an option. If not, what we typically do is go to market in the same way that we would to find a housemate normally. So that's through channels like Flatmate Finders, flatmates.com, Facebook. In the case of a host, we sometimes might be reverse searching to say, hey, is anyone expressions of interest on who would like to provide this sort of support? Or we might reach out to people who have advertised a granny flat, say, and we say, we have a unique opportunity, would you be interested? And then there would be following screenings to make sure that is a match and that will work. But it can be very dependent as well on the area to how long this process takes and the success of finding a suitable host or housemate.
Okay, cool. And how's Kim doing now?
Great. Yeah. Working towards long-term goals, which we love. Always moving towards living with a friend.
Oh, lovely. Bianca, take us through Amir and Salim.
Yep. So this is an example of them having a shared goal of not living with parents, socializing with peers. And in this case, sort of we obviously have discussed and kind of set up the ILA. And so in this case, it's Amir that rents a room from Salim's parents, who are the owners. So it is providing some really stable housing for these two friends living together. And so it's a sort of owner renter, and they're in a 2-bedroom apartment together in Victoria. And their support arrangements is also the network of family and friends, so informal supports. And they alternate their support worker budgets to assist with sort of cleaning the apartment and cooking and things like that. And the support that's provided through Higher Up at that sort of stage 2 is led by a support team lead, and they assist to manage the supports and they sustain the housemate relationship. So having things like housemate meetings and really sort of, those like shared living arrangements, just like anybody else, making sure there's sort of those little niggles of living together don't get too big, and that they can really maintain that friendship of living together, and as well as liaising with sort of friends and family and having things like care team meetings, making sure that they're conducted.
And is that something that you, as the home and living consultants, I'm so conscious of time, but is that something as you as home and living consultants, you would facilitate those?
Those monitoring.
Yeah.
So our monitoring. We have quite a robust monitoring framework that we've sort of iterated, from having sort of these implementations and through the sort of progress. And so we really find that support team lead, that person on the ground, they have a really good monitoring. Their part is monitoring, and then there's also the home and living consultant. So it's sort of 2 personnel within our provisions that provide that monitoring, and it's an ongoing support.
Okay, I'll let the audience just read through the final one, because what I want to do is just let everybody know how they can get in touch with you guys. We'll obviously send a follow-up email as well, but it sounds like the work that you do is so highly specialised, and that hopefully we've sparked a lot of curiosity with people in the room today thinking, oh, hang on a second, Terry or Jerry or Kerry would absolutely love to explore this. So how do anybody in the call today, how do they make contact with you?
So we'll pop it in, we can pop it in the chat here, but the best way to make contact with us is through our business development team. They're fantastic, but we'll put in the details of some information for an email and a phone call. Otherwise, we will be sending out an email to everyone following this, and go ahead, respond, say, put me through to those people, whatever it takes it'll come through.
Tell me what the difference is again. I can't quite get it.
Exactly.
Yeah, 100%.
Send it through and it will find its way. They know that, and we can definitely get back to you.
Just a really quick one. I know I've got 1 minute left, so I'm going to be very respectful for everyone's time, but it's actually a really interesting question. Does the application process require face-to-face meetings, or can these be done virtually for rural remote participants?
Yeah, absolutely can be done virtually. So typically for us, especially for the application process, it can. That will involve some robust conversations. And we also, of course, it doesn't matter if it's remote, we'll still be engaging the person at the centre through Zoom, phone call, or whatever other communication modality works for them.
I love how the way that we're ending this webinar is that you reminded everybody that participants at the centre of this entire conversation. So
absolutely
nailed it. Well done. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We are bang on time. I do apologise for the technical glitches that we had earlier, but I do hope that everyone's taken something valuable from this webinar. We will obviously be sending a link to this recording post us cleaning up all the little glitches that we've had, and you can obviously get in touch with the higher up team through the channels. We will put this in the chat and also in our follow-up email, and Plan Partners can be called on 1300 333 700. We have live chat, we have BRMs all over the place, so please don't be a stranger, and we will see you all at our next webinar. Thank you so much. Have a fantastic day.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.